Hey, welcome back. So Excel's business intelligence tools actually go far, far beyond simply being able to extract and transform external data sources. In addition to just dropping these data sets into worksheet tabs, we can also add them to what's known as the Excel data model, which is truly the cornerstone of Excel's business intelligence capabilities. Standard Excel worksheets are limited to around 1 million rows of data. And for most practical purposes, less than that, unless your computer has a lot of memory. But Excel's data model doesn't suffer from these constraints. With its efficient engine for storing and compressing data, it allows you to analyze data sets of potentially hundreds of millions of rows right from your desktop. And even more importantly, it allows us to build pivot tables, or power pivot tables, if you will, that provide analytics from multiple separate data sets in a single place. No more creating a different pivot table for every different data source you have. That's where we're going, but first things first. Let's take a quick look at the data we'll be using these tools to explore. Now here we have a group of CSV files, which will be the basis of our examples for the next part of the course. These files contain data about a fictional online surf shop, a place where people can buy surfing supplies or just things you'd want to take to the beach online. We'll dig deeper into the exact kind of data that's contained in each file as we go, but suffice it to say, each file either contains information about a business process or reference information about things like products, customers, or regions. Now, as always, the first step is going to be to simply pull this data into Excel so we can work with it with Excel's business intelligence tools. We'll start with the order details file, which contains a row of data for every line item in every customer order. So if one particular customer order had 5 different products in it, the order details file is going to have 5 rows for that order. So to import that file into Excel, we'll use Power Query just as we have with previous examples. So I'll go to my Data tab, and then Get Data, from File, from Text CSV, and now I'll simply select my order details file and click Import. And before I load this file into either Excel or the data model, I'm going to hit this Transform Data button just to preview the data in the Power Query editor and make sure everything looks like I expect before I start trying to analyze the data. And in general, this is a best practice when importing data into Excel. You should pretty much always opt to transform data, even if you think the data won't require any changes, just so you have clarity on exactly how Excel is handling that import. So we'll hit Transform Data, and we see that Excel promoted headers, which is always an important step to check for. And then the other thing we generally want to check for is the data types that Excel assigned to the different columns of data. Most of these look fine, but we see that Excel has not assigned a currency data type to our unit price field. So we'll actually change that. I'll select this field, and then go to the Transform tab of the Power Query editor, and then simply change my data type to currency. And to Excel's question, yes, I do want to replace the current type conversion. And with that change made, I think we're ready to load this data set into Excel. And because this section is about the data model, we're not going to load it into an Excel worksheet. We're just going to load it to the Excel data model exclusively. So I'll go to the Home tab, and then I'll click the arrow under the Close and Load button. And then instead of choosing Close and Load, I'll choose Close and Load To, so I can specify exactly where and how this data set is to be loaded. Now again, I don't want the data to be dropped into a table in an Excel worksheet where it will needlessly take up space. Instead, I want to only create a connection to that data set, and then I want to add the data to the data model. So now I'll click OK. And we can see on our Queries and Connections pane that our data set has loaded. And then we can check our data model just to confirm that the data has loaded there. So I'll click my Power Pivot tab on the ribbon, and then the Manage button on that tab. And now we have confirmation that our data is in the data model. Now that's all fine and good, but the real point of the data model is the ability to create pivot tables that synthesize large amounts of data from multiple sources in a single place. So let's take the first step in that direction by creating a pivot table from our lone table in the data model. Now you can actually do this directly from the data model by clicking this pivot table button here. But I want to show you how you can create a pivot table from the data model right from an Excel worksheet without even being in the data model. So I'll close out of the data model, and then close our Queries and Connections pane to make some room. And now I'm just going to insert a pivot table the same way we always would. I'll go to my Insert tab, and then hit the Pivot Table button. And now if we look at the dialog box, we see there are 3 options for the type of data that we can source our pivot table from. One is a table or range in our worksheet, one is an external data source, and the third, that is selected by default, is our workbook's data model. That's obviously what we want, so let's go ahead and click OK. And the pivot table field list we see here is pretty much the same as any other pivot table field list. But we see that because we had added our order details table to the data model, it's listed in the field list by default without us having to explicitly select it in some way. And if I click this little arrow next to it, the area under the table expands, and we now see a list of all the fields in that table available for us to select. So just for the purpose of this example, I'll drag my product ID to the rows area of the pivot table, and then I'll drag our order quantity down to the values section to be summed. Now the problem with this view is we only have the IDs for our various products in this order details table. There's nothing more descriptive like a product name. That data is contained in a separate table specific to products. As a result, what we need is a way to combine the products table with our order details table here in our reporting. Well, that's where relationships come in. Relationships allow us to tie different tables together based on fields they have in common. So we can use fields from both tables in a single pivot table. This works kind of like a VLOOKUP, or even the merge queries we saw in the Power Query section. But the big difference is that the source data is kept separate, not mashed together in a single giant table. It's only in the pivot table where data is combined in a unified view. We'll talk a lot more about the rationale for keeping data in the data model separate in another video. But one immediate advantage is that we don't even need to take that extra step of combining the 2 data sets together. Our pivot table can treat multiple tables as a combined data set, even if they're kept separate in the data model. It all comes down to the relationships we use to connect those tables. And for now, we need some additional data points to make our pivot table summary more meaningful. So let's start with pulling in more information about products so we can put something besides these ugly product IDs in the rows area. Now the first step in that process will be to import our products dataset. So we'll go back to our Data tab, and then Get Data from File, from Text CSV, and now we'll import our products table. And again, we'll choose Transform Data just to make sure our data is importing the way we want. And it looks like headers were promoted. And while our data types generally make sense, I'm still going to change the data types of our list price and cost columns to currency. And now with that done, I'm going to go to my Home tab, Close and Load to. And again, I'm going to only want to create a connection to this data set, and I'm going to want to add it to the data model. So now I'll click OK. And now that my products table is loaded, we'll go back to our Power Pivot tab, and then hit Manage to see our data model. And in the data view of the data model, you can see that our products dataset has been added as a new tab, much like a worksheet in a standard Excel workbook. But where this gets much more interesting is if we go to our diagram view. Now we see these representations of our order details and products tables side by side. Now as things currently stand, we won't be able to use both of these tables meaningfully in a single pivot table. But we can change that with a single step. All we have to do is create a relationship between these tables. So if we look at the fields listed in each table, we see there is a product ID in both tables. Now, if these tables were just worksheets in an Excel workbook, and you were trying to VLOOKUP your products data into your order details data, you would use product ID as your lookup value. Similarly, if you were performing a merge query in Power Query, product ID would be the key you use to link these two data sets. So naturally, that's how we're going to form a relationship between these two tables in the diagram view of the data model. And doing it is super easy. It's literally a drag and drop process. So I'll select my product ID field in the products table, and then click and hold down my mouse button to drag, and simply drag over to my product ID field in the order details table. And just like that, the data model has generated this relationship between those two tables on product ID. Now you may notice that the line that connects these two tables has a 1 on one side and an asterisk on the other. We'll get into exactly what that means later on, but for now, suffice it to say, these two tables are connected in such a way that we can use them both in the same pivot table. So let's close out of our data model. And now back in our pivot table, we'll click the Pivot Table Analyze Contextual tab that appears in our ribbon whenever we've selected anything inside of a pivot table. And then to make room for our pivot table field list, I'll close out of our Queries and Connections pane. And now if we scroll down through the list of fields available to our pivot table, all of a sudden we see we have a brand new table available for us to select from, the products table. And then if I click to expand that, now we have all the fields in that table available to add. So what we want here is to have product names on the rows of our pivot table instead of those ugly product IDs. So I'll first remove product ID from the rows area, and now I'll simply drag in product name from the products table. And look at that. Now we have a summarized view of order quantities by product name based on data in two different tables. And we didn't even have to resort to some crazy solution where we used tens of thousands of VLOOKUP formulas to smash these data sets together. Instead, we executed a simple drag and drop operation to relate those two tables, and the Excel data model did the rest. And just to reiterate, note that this is the only worksheet in our Excel workbook. The data in our order details and products data sets is not stored in a conventional workbook. It is being compressed and stored in an incredibly efficient way in the Excel data model. Okay, now we've seen how the data model can help us combine multiple data sets into a single pivot table report. But you may still be wondering why we need to keep those data sets separate in the data model. So let's take a quick detour into exactly why that's a best practice, and dig a little deeper into the dynamics of these relationships. That's up next. I'll see you then.